The global elite, our saviors, our masters, our kings, queens, and presidents, drafting a new world order in secret and publicly behaving like the privileged scumbags they truly are. Whether you're a banker, a sheik, or a connected politician,
what difference at this point does it make?
One thing is for sure, the rules don't apply to you. The New York Post reports a Saudi Arabian prince is accused by 3 female staffers of acting like a bizarre party boy, engaging in a gay sex act in front of them, threatening a woman's life, and declaring, "I'm a prince, and I do what I want." CNN reports the Saudi prince is no longer facing felony assault charges, but could still face a misdemeanor as the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office reviews a woman's complaint that the royal tried to force her to perform a sex act on him. Prince Mahed Abdulaziz Al Saud, originally arrested on suspicion of sexual assault, false imprisonment, and battery, was released last month on $300,000 bail in connection with the September 23rd incident. The Saudi prince is no longer facing felony assault charges. The case is now being evaluated for possible misdemeanor charges. You may remember back in 2011, French presidential candidate Chouin and former IMF chief Dominique Strauss-Kahn was arrested and charged with an alleged sexual assault and attempted rape in a New York City hotel. Dominique Strauss-Kahn was only to be charged later and acquitted of aggravated pimping in France earlier this year.
The 66-year-old admitted taking part in orgies, but denied knowing the women were prostitutes.
Or the Delaware court's decision to spare Robert H. Richards, the wealthy DuPont heir, an 8-year prison sentence because he would not fare well. After being convicted, Richards' 8-year prison sentence for raping his toddler daughter was suspended. The elite live outside of law and are creating a new world order from all directions. In the words of Lord Christopher Monckton, a world government is going to be created. The word government actually appears as the first of 3 purposes of the new entity. The second purpose is the transfer of wealth from the countries of the West to third world countries. And the third purpose of this new entity, this government, is enforcement. They are about to impose a communist world government on the world, warned Lord Monckton. They are coming from all sides, as is completely obvious to anyone with ears or eyes to hear or read, as the Department of Justice, rather than focusing on the numerous Islamic terror cells residing in the United States or the threat crossing our borders, will instead focus on returning veterans, Christians, and gun owners through their newly formed Domestic Terror Council, prosecuting anti-government and hate groups, regardless of the First Amendment. Assistant Attorney General John Carlin, who oversees national security at the Justice Department, announced the new position, the Domestic Terrorism Council, following a number of violent attacks or plots against the U.S. that he said were motivated by anti-government views, racism, bigotry, and anarchy, and other despicable beliefs. This is how democracy dies. This is how ideas, opinions, and freedom are squashed in the noonday sun. This is how totalitarian criminals with zero real-world experience regarding their fellow human counterparts dismantle a government that has no room for their lunacy and cruelty. John Bound for Infowars.com. The ghetto, not the place you would imagine methods of global dominance to spring from. But it was in the ghettos across the United States that Saul Alinsky would fine-tune tactics of civil disobedience that would one day be employed by New World Order puppet Barack Hussein Obama.
Resolutions of ideal problems always carry within their wake another problem.
Alinsky's Rules for Radicals is the left's playbook, chock full of creeping tactics used by scheming politicians and Soros-fueled millennial generation groups like Black Lives Matter.
All lives matter, and I'm a black guy.
Hell-bent on tearing the fabric of American society apart.
The anti-cop rhetoric that is sweeping the United States of America, fueled by this group, some of the vulgar, vile, vicious rhetoric that's coming out, talking about killing cops.
The pig is the big ass
Alinsky's albeit deceptively noble attempt to create a system to reward the have-nots with the power and surplus of the haves would prove to be just as useful for the New World Order sycophants to achieve an uprooting of American values and an overpass of the United States constitutional foundation to be replaced by totalitarianism disguised as compassionate socialism. These tactics simply needed the perfect charismatic turncoat to steer them. Enter Barack Obama.
All of us want to give our president every tool necessary to do this. And all of us were willing to do that in this bill. And anyone who says otherwise is lying to the American people.
Saul Alinsky died decades before a young pre-Senate Barack Obama would spend 3 years following in Alinsky's footsteps as a community organizer. In 2009, the National Review stated, Obama's mentors from his Chicago days studied at a school Alinsky founded, and they taught their students the philosophy and methods of one of the first community organizers. Saul Alinsky wrote in Rules for Radicals, "As an organizer, I start from where the world is, as it is, not as I would like it to be. That we accept the world as it is doesn't in any sense weaken our desire to change it into what we believe it should be. It is necessary to begin where the world is if we are going to change it to what we think it should be. That means working in the system." So what are some of the tactics being utilized in that system at accelerating degrees in the shaping of modern American society? Rule number 1, power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. Obama and the nutjobs in the nation's capital would have us all believe that they have overwhelming support from the have-nots, while destroying the middle class, increasing the debt and welfare class to unsustainable levels, and projecting it all from their mainstream media bubble. Rule number 2, never go outside the expertise of your people. Basically, why bother engaging in a rational debate based on facts with your adversary? Simply bring up the despised policies or traditions and belittle them until they are crushed.
Less than loving expressions by Christians? I get concerned.
That's right. Let's criticize Christianity on Easter, you piece of
But
crap.
that's a topic for another day.
Skipping to rule number 8, keep the pressure on. Never let up. Obama must say this rule to himself every morning. As one shoe drops, another one is ready to fall. Not in the manner of a leader responding to a country's pleas in the midst of a crisis, but more in the vein of a tyrant, quietly and charismatically creating them, while offering shallow direction as stale as his predecessor's rhetoric. And if just that sample of Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals wasn't enough, Alinsky even dedicated the left's playbook to Lucifer himself.
I suppose, given a choice, I think I would pick hell. The reason I'd pick hell is because that's where all the have-nots are.
John Bound for Infowars.com.
They set them loose, Madam Secretary, because you're running for president. Millions of taxpayer dollars on this abusive effort to derail Secretary Clinton's presidential campaign.
Of course, it's political. Problem is, the Democrats don't like tasting their own poison. Notice we don't hear the Democrats apologizing for the Justice Department's targeting of journalists, or the IRS's targeting of conservative groups and Christian organizations. But Ranking Member Democratic Representative Elijah Cummings limiting the investigation to a simple political attack would mean that the American public suffers from mass amnesia.
CNN has learned the CIA is involved in what one source calls an unprecedented attempt to keep the spy agency's Benghazi secrets from ever leaking out.
Benghazi is about the NSC directing an operation that is perhaps shadowy, perhaps has a presidential finding, perhaps doesn't, that takes arms and men and puts them into Syria in the guise of the Free Syrian Army.
Whatever Stevens was involved with, it became very well known to these terrorists, these radicals, who he may have been dealing with, that he was more than just an ambassador. I think he was targeted, and I think the reason that the military was told to stand down is, look, the military we know that stovepiping still goes on between the Pentagon and the CIA. And, you know, if the CIA is up to something, they don't want the military involved. And I think that's what we had in Benghazi. I think this was a CIA operation, and I don't care how many Marines were off the coast. They were not going to be called in. And again, Obama, basically, you know, this gets back to what I wrote. The guy comes from the CIA family. He has a background. He knows when he's responsible for the CIA operation. He's not going to say a word about it. And, you know, he'll remain silent for 7 hours, 8 hours, or, you know, however long it takes.
Ambassador Stevens met with his last visitor of the day, which apparently was the Turkish representative. That's notable. Turkey is partnering with us right now in a covert action to help do two things. Increasing level of intelligence we're aware of by using the Turkish intelligence assets on the ground in Syria, and by actually working with us to quote-unquote arm the friendly rebels, whoever they are. And I think that's notable by the fact Ambassador Stevens met with this Turkish representative right before the firefight.
The corporate media was forced to admit that the Benghazi attack was staged by a State Department-hired jihadist security outfit in connection with an arms transfer to al-Qaeda mercenaries in Syria. However, later on, these facts were deemed as speculation by the mainstream media as the Obama administration continued to cover up the real reason for the murder of Ambassador Stevens, downplaying the incident and characterizing it as a non-event, not requiring congressional investigation, and the impeachment of President Obama. The Obama administration announced in late September that it planned to expand a program to secure and destroy Libya's huge stockpile of dangerous surface-to-air missiles, and that the U.S. State Department has one official on the ground in Libya, as well as 5 contractors who specialize in explosive ordnance disposal, all working with the rebel Transitional National Council to find the looted missiles, ABC News reported. Doubtless, instead, they became part of the CIA stockpile destined ultimately for ISIS in Syria. Hillary's song and dance on Capitol Hill was a sideshow, ignoring the CIA's secret arms transfer elephant in the room.
Why has no one been held accountable? How come not a single person lost a single paycheck connected to the fact that we had the first ambassador killed since 1979?
The laws that govern those decisions were followed very carefully.
Yes, ma'am. I'm not asking what the ARB did. I'm asking what you did.
There could not be immediate action taken, but there was a process that was immediately instituted and which led to decisions being made.
Yes, ma'am. The decision was to put these back at full back pay and keep them on as employees.
If the Democrats on this committee had their way, dozens of witnesses never would have been interviewed. Your public record would still be private. Thousands of documents never would have been accessed. And we wouldn't have the emails of our own ambassador. That may be smart politics, but it is a lousy way to run a serious investigation.
John Bound for Infowars.com. Filed under What's Old is New Again are the alarming steps Michael Springman, a high-level State Department official, took to inform the federal government that unqualified foreign applicants were being issued visas prior to 9/11. In Saudi Arabia, I was repeatedly ordered by high-level State Department officials to issue visas to unqualified applicants, Springman told the BBC prior to the 9/11 attack. These were essentially people who had no ties either to Saudi Arabia or to their own country. I complained bitterly at the time there. I returned to the U.S. I complained to the State Department here, to the General Accounting Office, to the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, and to the Inspector General's office. I was met with silence.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Fast forward approximately 15 years later, and Obama sounds like a broken record being played in an empty hall.
Meanwhile, here at home, the Department of Homeland Security is updating its alert system to help the American people stay vigilant and safe. And as always, our extraordinary men and women in uniform continue to put their lives on the line. in this campaign.
Meanwhile, the Mirror UK reports hackers have claimed that a number of Islamic State supporters' social media accounts are being run from internet addresses linked to the Department of Work and Pensions. The hacking collective showed Mirror Online details of the IP addresses used by a trio of separate digital jihadis to access Twitter accounts, which were then used to carry out online recruitment and propaganda campaigns. At first glance, the IP addresses seem to be based in Saudi Arabia, but upon further inspection using specialist tools, they appeared to link back to the Department of Work and Pensions. The British government has admitted selling large numbers of internet addresses to Saudi Arabia, but has refused to reveal how much it has earned from the transaction. Although the government announced plans to auction its surplus IP numbers, it can now be revealed that a chunk of them went to Saudi Telecom and the Saudi-based mobile telecommunications company. Of course, the inept, record-breaking, tax-sucking behemoth known as the U.S. federal government, with all of its trillions spent on surveilling the average American's phone calls, emails, and browser history, and storing it all in a huge database guarded by psychotic thugs, can't be bothered with monitoring the social media of potential terrorists entering the United States. The Hill reports Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson decided against ending a secret U.S. policy that prohibits immigration officials from reviewing social media posts of foreigners applying for U.S. visas. A DHS spokesman told ABC News that in the fall of 2014, the department began 3 pilot programs to include social media in vetting, but officials say it's still not a widespread policy and review is underway. Could the massacre that occurred in San Bernardino have been prevented had the feds actually done what most Americans thought they'd been doing all along? Probably not. The TSA can barely do their job, sporting a pathetic 95% failure rate. The status quo is tearing into 2 separate realities. The arrogant, compulsive fabrication the criminals in Washington, D.C. are still hawking, and another reality that for most Americans is a big pill to swallow. The growing evidence that layers of $1 trillion shadow government's nefarious inner workings are exponentially coming to light. For many Americans, admitting that your president is a traitor based upon all of the evidence is difficult to look squarely in the eye.
You know, George W. Bush, after he staged 9/11 with his daddy, he said, you're either with us or with those Al-Qaeda terrorists they hired on record. Well, I got news for the New World Order. You're either with humanity or you're against us, and we're coming.
John Bound for Infowars.com. Back in April of 2015, 55 civil society organizations, security experts, and academics signed a letter opposing CISA. Then in October of 2015, the Senate passed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act by a vote of 74 to 21. That act quietly slipped its way into the government funding omnibus bill that was recently signed into law by President Obama. However, the CISA privacy provisions added to the omnibus stripped even more privacy protections than the October version. They took a bad bill and they made it worse, says Robin Green, policy counsel for the Open Technology Institute. Essentially, warrantless searches of anyone's private information will be shared between third-party companies and a whole new host of federal agency portals, local police fusion centers, and as a side effect, foreign hackers. Wired reports the earlier bill had only allowed that back-channel use of the data for law enforcement in cases of imminent threats, while the new bill requires just a specific threat, potentially allowing the search of the data for any specific terms regardless of timelines.
Fact is, not every bill with cybersecurity in the title is necessarily a good idea. I believe this bill will do little to make Americans safer, but will potentially reduce the personal privacy of millions of Americans in a very substantial way. The groups that I'm talking about are ones with members who have companies with millions and millions of customers. And they're saying they can't support this bill at this time. I think I know why. These companies who didn't have a problem with previous kinds of versions of this legislation are saying they don't support it. These companies, Mr. President, are hearing from their customers. And they're worried that their customers are saying, this doesn't look like it's going to protect our privacy. Of course we want to be safe. We also want to have our liberty. Ben Franklin famously said anyone who gives up their liberty to have security really doesn't deserve either.
In 2013, declassified documents revealed that the NSA had been scooping up thousands of emails of citizens it wasn't allowed to target. Simply put, if the government has any concern, whether real or imagined, about John Q. Public, they can easily raid any and everything Mr. Public shares online, and there is nothing John Q. can do about it. Emails, financial information, political philosophy, all of this done in the name of the CIA's blockbuster fail, The Interview, after Americans were sold the propaganda that North Korea had hacked Hollywood. Americans are now surveilled from the skies, wiretapped through their cell phones. Energy usage is gathered by smart meters for the inevitable carbon taxation coming, and all personal documents and information are devoured online without Americans' consent. This makes the East German secret police, the Stasi, look like the Cub Scouts. Completely unconstitutional, completely un-American, and illegal, dealing a final death blow to the Fourth Amendment. Solutions for the time being? Use a VPN service and change your DNS server. It won't be long before you are officially informed that you are no longer an American citizen. Your new self-identity is as the property of the New World Order. God bless what's left of America. John Bound for Infowars.com. During the Christmas holiday, back in 1913, Congress enacted a communistic centralization of your money, transferred to the control of an elite few. Communistic, you say? Well, the second plank of the Communist Manifesto states a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. The fifth plank states centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Those planks have been long established in the United States, so it stands to reason that we are living in a somewhat communist country. Of course, all of the planks, if researched, apply to the current state of government in the U.S. in one way, shape, or form. For instance, plank number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transportation in the hands of the state. Of course, the FCC is all over the control of communications, not to mention the NSA and your friendly neighborhood fusion center, and a lot of socialist-controlled examples such as the Postal Service and the government's control of Amtrak and Conrail represents the government's hand being placed in the free enterprise cookie jar for the world to see. But that's only the beginning of where government-controlled transportation is heading. The Huffington Post reports, there's growing confusion about how would-be flyers from Louisiana, Minnesota, New Hampshire, and New York will board planes when provisions of the Real ID Act go into effect, because their state ID and driver's license processes fail to meet federal standards. Passengers from those 4 states would likely need a passport or, in the case of non-citizens, immigration documents for air travel within the United States. The rules raise several concerns. There's the expense of acquiring a passport or other approved document. Then there's the potential for disorder, as agitated passengers learn too late they can't get through security. The Department of Homeland Security's website reveals that starting on October 10th, visitors seeking access to military bases and almost all federal facilities using their state-issued driver's licenses or ID cards must present proper identification issued by Real ID compliant states. DHS continues. To be clear, this update does not affect identification shown at the airports in the United States. Until announced otherwise, the TSA will continue to accept valid driver's license and ID cards issued by all states. DHS plans to announce the schedule for any changes to air travel requirements by the end of the year, and will ensure that state governments and the traveling public are notified at least 120 days in advance of implementation. In the very near and real future, a real-life controlled matrix where transportation is no longer an individual right. CNN reports Ford says the newest edition of its X-Max car has a new technology that scans traffic signs and adjusts the throttle to help drivers stay within legal speed limits and avoid fines. But the automated cars won't be obeying the speed limits. BBC reports Google's self-driving cars are programmed to exceed speed limits by up to 10 miles per hour, according to the project's lead software engineer. Dmitry Dolgov told Reuters that when surrounding vehicles were breaking the speed limit, going more slowly could actually present a danger, and the Google car would accelerate to keep up. Of course, Google just wants you pesky humans to know that all 16 and counting reported self-driving car accidents weren't their fault. It was the fault of those meddling humans that reek of racial guilt and outdated individual freedom. The Daily Mail reports Google's self-driving car has been involved in several accidents since it was launched, all caused by humans, its testers claim. Driving a big, beautiful speed demon anywhere you want without Big Brother sitting in the passenger seat is simply one of those fading American rights that should awaken even the most jaded American mind. Freedom to move when, how, and where you want to in the United States is priceless until the socialistic, communistic, corporocratic New World Order buys up that freedom and hands it over to their next installed puppet dictator with a big red bow on it. I suppose jolly old Nick better get his self-driving sleigh upgraded so the NSA can check their list to make sure if he's been naughty or nice. John Brown for Infowars.com.
The Army is very proud of the new American city they've built to practice martial law. The government really can do something quickly. They built this 300-acre city in just 2 years. Compare that to how long they take in your city just to build a road. But then they did have $96 million of your tax money to play with.
To transition from an army of execution, doing what we've got to do, to an army of preparation to be ready for what comes next. This is a place where we can be creative and you can come up with solutions for problems that we don't even know we have yet.
The public may not know the problem yet because they haven't yet executed the false flag event that they'll use to openly activate martial law, but the military has been creating scenarios where they can justify a move against small-town America for quite some time. And they've made it clear that their enemy is gun owners, veterans, those who want a small limited government, and Christians. The UK Telegraph reported that the town was complete with a subway, railroad, football field, and mosque. Mosque? That's not a mosque. That's a small-town Christian church with a steeple and Gothic windows. Mosques have minarets, rounded arches, etc. It's not that they've kept the current military's attitude toward Christians a secret either. It was the U.S. Army that conflated the Ku Klux Klan with mainstream Christian groups like the American Family Association or the Family Research Council, calling these mainstream evangelical groups hate groups. In just the last year, an official Army email and briefings at both Fort Hood, Texas and Camp Shelby, Mississippi attacked Christian groups and said they don't share Army values. Most recently, we've seen a FOIA request that showed last year's training scenario in Ohio identified gun owners and people who believe in limited government as the enemy. And then there's retired Colonel Kevin Benson, currently teaching at Fort Leavenworth, who spelled it out clearly in his vision of the future. When the leaders of the group hold a press conference to announce their goals, they invoke the Declaration of Independence, and they argue that the current form of the federal government is not deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed, but is actually destructive to these ends. Therefore, they say the people can alter or abolish the existing government and replace it with another. And while mainstream politicians and citizens react with alarm, to the words of the Declaration of Independence, the Tea Party insurrectionists in South Carolina enjoy groundswell of support from other Tea Party groups, militias, racist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. And as we've shown you many times in the past, U.S. military documents describing CONUS operations, that's the continental United States, where rules regarding the use of deadly force in confronting dissidents are made disturbingly clear with the directive that a warning shot will not be fired. Or this document that talks about policies that would be applied within U.S. territory, with the internment, resettlement, indoctrination, and re-education of political dissidents using their social security number. Clearly, it's not for foreign operations. And finally, I think it's significant how detailed these buildings are. They could easily train for foreign urban warfare using concrete shells of buildings which are cheaper, and that's what they've done in the past. But here they have a completely intact American town, down to the Washington, D.C. subway logos, and a small church building. Looks like they're training for a different kind of conflict. President James Madison wrote, "The means of defense against foreign danger have always been the instruments of tyranny at home." But as Alex Jones pointed out in his documentary 9/11, The Road to Tyranny, way back in 2001, FEMA was telling firefighters and other emergency personnel in Kansas that the Founding Fathers were terrorists.
That's very difficult. When people are passionate about what they believe in, they become a very difficult enemy to beat. Who was the first terrorist organization in the United States? Who? Founding Fathers. Founding Fathers. You mean Thomas Jefferson? Oh, yeah. You mean George Washington? Oh, yeah. Paul Revere? Yeah. These guys right here, let me ask you something. Did they try to scare people? Oh, yeah. They tried to intimidate the British. Did they use acts of violence? Your founding fathers, my founding fathers, were involved in acts of terrorism.
Posse Comitatus? Constitution? That's just yesterday's red tape.